Well, hello everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kubelman. I am the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us for this very important and timely discussion on how to address Afghanistan's worsening economic crisis. This event, organized by the Wilson Center's Asia Program, is part of the Center's Hindsight Upfront initiative, which aims to ensure a continued focus on Afghanistan after the US withdrawal. I'd like to thank our partners for this event. We are co-hosting this event with an informal group of senior Afghanistan hands, many of them former officials. It is co-chaired by Ambassador Tony Wayne, one of our speakers today, along with Rahula Osmani. I thank Tony and Rahula for their support for this event. I also thank the Wilson Center's Middle East program for serving as a co-sponsor. Let me just provide some brief framing for this event. We all know about the terrible humanitarian crisis that Afghanistan is experiencing right now. The acute food insecurity, with millions in danger of starvation over the next year, nearly 100% of the population likely to be plunged into poverty in 2022. Basic services, including healthcare, unavailable due to lack of funds. This is a story that is being discussed daily and for good reason. Our event today, however, intends to go beyond the humanitarian crisis and focus on the broader economic crisis that Afghanistan is facing, one that is above all a liquidity crisis. Afghanistan is heavily dependent on international assistance. At the time of the Taliban takeover, about 75% of government expenses came from foreign grants, and that international assistance accounted for a whopping 40% of annual GDP in Afghanistan. And yet international sanctions and frozen assets have meant that money is not flowing into the country. Banks are out of money, almost out of money. Businesses are struggling to operate. People aren't getting paid, and the economy is struggling to function. And aid and other economic experts believe that the Afghan economy could contract by 30, 40, or even 50% in the coming year. And according to the New York Times, in an article just published recently, in a decision that has not yet been formally announced, the US government plans to split up about $7 billion in frozen Afghan central bank assets between humanitarian assistance for Afghans and assistance for 9/11 victims' families. That's a decision that could have major impacts on Afghanistan's economy. We'll discuss that today. The focus of our discussion is how to address this broader economic crisis, how to go about getting money injected back into the Afghan economy, even with the constraints posed by sanctions and the world's non-recognition of the Taliban government. None of us participating in this event today mean to diminish the importance of the immediate humanitarian crisis. We all agree that efforts must continue to bring relief supplies into Afghanistan, especially as the brutal winter continues. But the economic crisis deserves attention because it is of such great scale that humanitarian relief alone is not enough to right Afghanistan's economic ship. Also, if steps are not taken to address Afghanistan's liquidity crisis and its banking crisis, then the humanitarian crisis won't go away. Food shipments and other relief supplies for the humanitarian crisis, as critical as they are, will only be temporary band-aids if the broader economic challenges aren't addressed. The international community is well aware of this, and speaking from a normative context, there is a strong consensus in key capitals that something must be done beyond humanitarian relief to bring more sustainable relief to Afghans. To quote a joint statement representing European and the US government after a meeting with the Taliban in Oslo earlier this month, quote, "We noted that our governments are supporting the revival of Afghanistan's economy. Participants noted the importance of increasing cash liquidity and support to the banking sector in order to help stabilize the Afghan economy." So the consensus within the international community around the vision is there, but in terms of developing actual plans for easing this economic crisis, there's no consensus on that. And that's where I think events like today's can be helpful. We've convened a terrific group of experts, all former senior officials in the Afghan and American governments, to provide some solutions-based inputs. They've been asked to offer a proposal or recommendations or suggestions in concrete form about how to address Afghanistan's economic crisis given the constraints. Now, there have already been a number of suggestions put out there by economists and other independent experts, and we'll get to some of them today, but we wanted to dedicate a full session to considering a range of proposals from a great range of thinkers. And indeed, we're really fortunate to have this group with us. We have with us in Kabul, Khosrow Fazli, the CEO of Ghaznafar Bank. We also have with us Khalid Payenda, the former Afghan finance minister, Khalil Sadiq, a former governor of the Afghanistan Central Bank, Julia Friedlander, a former senior policy advisor at the U.S. Treasury Department and currently a senior fellow and director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And last but not least, Earl Anthony Wayne, or Tony as we like to call him, a former career ambassador to Afghanistan, who's now a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center. So we'll have some brief opening comments from each panelist. We'll then have a discussion, and then I'll take questions for the panel from the audience. If you have a question, please email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org or tweet it to @AsiaProgram. One caveat I'll make before we start: our experts will be offering recommendations for how to move forward. These views represent their own views, not those of the Wilson Center, which is nonpartisan, does not take institutional positions on policy issues, but instead provides platforms for these policy discussions to take place. So with that, let's get started with the brief opening comments. And first, we're going to go to our speaker in Kabul, and that would be Mr. Khosrow Fazli. So Khosrow, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for being a great host. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak and share our thoughts and suggestions. I'm Khosrow Fazli, CEO of Ghaznafar Bank, and Ghaznafar Bank was licensed by the Central Bank of Afghanistan in 2009 to operate as a commercial private bank. Well, the situation remains particularly difficult as gradual deterioration in economic conditions continues. Overall inflation is being driven by increasing prices of basic household goods. Wages and demand for labor continues to decline. The skilled government and private sector employees are still leaving the country, which has created a significant challenge. The exchange rate continues to depreciate against US dollar and all foreign currencies. The deposits from the banks are still shrinking, and the availability of cash in the vault of the bank is decreased. Consequently, it's increased in the market. Since the financial sector is the backbone of a country's economy, therefore it's important the policymakers gave priority to this sector to bring financial stability. The banking sector in Afghanistan has already experienced 3 shocks. The first shock was when COVID spread in 2020. As a consequence, some banks in Afghanistan, due to delays in loans repayments and also increase in NPA, their profitability badly impacted. And the second shock, when the previous government lose the control of key provinces in Afghanistan. So the concern of all businessmen and women is started, and they started to transfer their deposits from banks in Afghanistan to their accounts overseas. Then the third shock, when the Taliban regime begins. When the Taliban took over Kabul and the US government froze the foreign exchange reserve, depositors panicked. The run started on the banks and wanted to withdraw their entire deposits in fear of losing money because the banks would not be able to pay or to honor the request of their depositors. So now it is extreme stress we are experiencing. As banking is all about trust, and due to the political crisis, people have lost their confidence in the banking sector. Therefore, individuals and entities are still trying to withdraw their deposits in different ways from the banking sector, which will lead to a harsh future. I believe there are different ways to control the crisis before being too late. The first option I suggest For the successful operation of the humanitarian financial corridor and to support the financial sector, perhaps the UN agencies, international organizations, and NGOs may initiate opening accounts with the banks and bring physical cash, which will help a smooth and proper implementation of the humanitarian operations and also rebuild the people's trust. Using the banks as a financial corridor will build people's confidence and help their liquidity crisis. Then the central bank may also take a balanced approach to bring relaxation on the imposed limits for the cash withdrawals or cash transfers. The second option, in some point, US Treasury Office may bring more relaxation to allow UN agencies or international organizations or Fed to work directly with the Central Bank of Afghanistan. The policymakers may work on its methodology, how to work in the current environment, but if the US government decides to release the portion of foreign exchange reserve, probably it would be an option to provide cash to the central bank directly. And the good news is that today in the New York Times, I heard that the Biden administration decided to unfreeze $3.5 billion assets. And I would like to appreciate the efforts and support of Jeffrey, President of Afghanistan American Chamber of Commerce. I understand, I know how he was trying to actually coordinate this matter between Afghanistan bankers and also with the US government to release a portion of these assets. And because of working with the central bank instead of a private commercial bank as a shadow of the central bank, it will build the trust of the people in the banking sector, and the central bank may start the functioning of auctions again, which is stopped from the last 6 months, and that will control further inflation and depreciation of local currency against foreign currencies. I think also the central bank needs more skilled employees to ensure sound monetary policy to promote low inflation, reduce the uncertainty in the financial system of Afghanistan, and help the financial system operate efficiently at the current crisis situation. There are some other steps that may control the banking sector crisis. Deposit insurance cover for the specified limits by the support of donors will be very helpful at the current situation. It will rebuild the confidence of the depositors and the people, and they will bring back again their cash to their accounts in the banks. Also, since the loan portfolio of the most banks is not performing, which is expected to increase further, will directly hit the bank's profitability. A decrease in the level of deposit and an increase in the non-performance assets level will force the banks to go to the undercapitalized situation. Therefore, banks will need new capital injections through the donors' support if any banks goes to the undercapitalized situation. Also, the donors may help the banks, or international or multilateral organizations may help the banks to establish correspondent bank relationship with banks in Afghanistan for approved transactions, as Afghanistan is an import-dependent country. Despite the issuing of general licenses by the US Treasury Department of Office of Foreign Asset Control, which was really helpful, still the correspondent banks are not feeling comfortable routing transactions related to Afghanistan because they have their own internal risk appetite, as the funds should settle through Afghanistan banks. And we are operating, by the way, under the supervisory of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. So this is also one of the major, or one of the constraint at the current situation, because when we are trying to send funds from Afghanistan to outside, or if any donor would or any NGO would like to transfer funds through our correspondent bank, so it's really tough to get the approval of US banks, because any US dollar transactions needs to process through the US banks. And there are lots of questions and inquiries, and sometimes, or most of the times, we don't take our fund if the fund is sending or routing through NGOs or international organizations to our correspondent banks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kisro. It's a really interesting food for thought with those suggestions, particularly those involving the central bank, which are key. And we'll get into that more a bit later. But let's now move on to our second speaker, Khalid Payenda. Over to you.
Good morning and good afternoon. Good morning in Washington, D.C. and the East Coast, and good afternoon in Kabul and other places. I'm honored to be part of this panel and talk about this important and timely discussion. At the outset, I wanted to thank the Wilson Center for hosting this discussion, but I also wanted to thank the informal group on Afghanistan, ably organized by Ambassador Tony Wayne and my friend Rohul Osmani, who contribute so much with the informal setting they have on these discussions. I'll dive straight into my opening remarks. Just a bit of background: that the Afghan economy was already reeling last summer from a combination of drought, third wave of COVID, and the displacements that were due to intensified fight and also the drought. But let's not forget that this current situation could have been avoided had the Taliban not captured power by force, and had the international community not suspended abruptly its aid portfolio. We might not have been in this dire situation. While we will not talk about humanitarian assistance, but I wanted to mention that Afghanistan needs more than humanitarian assistance. An economy has collapsed. Feeding people will not do it. Ensuring service delivery, such as health, education, and community development, to start with, are crucial first steps to make sure that the larger portion of the population does not slip into poverty. So what needs to be done? I think the action and immediate action is needed. I see a lot of reluctance from key players in development in Afghanistan, and I'd be very frank, history will not judge them very fairly if they continue to do this. I believe there is a role for the IMF and the World Bank to start engage. You do not have to start recognizing Taliban to be able to help with the situation. At least get this facts and basis of data and surveillance correct. Aid effectiveness, I want to stress this, is less about the quantity of money, but more how it's channeled and spent. While the humanitarian aid and humanitarian plus appeal by UN has resulted in some of the pledges, but we need to see them on the ground, and it's more how those aid is channeled, because in my experience, I've seen that it's more about how you spend money rather than the quantity of money. I think I have a couple of points for the Taliban as well. I do not want to anger people with political comments. I don't think it's my place. It's for people who deal with politics, but I believe there is no other way other than working with a government. And I hope that the Taliban understand this, and I hope that they've learned from the mistakes that other regimes have made in the past. True legitimacy comes from Afghans in the country. If the Taliban want recognition internationally, they must understand, and that legitimacy does not come from foreign embassies, but the Afghan people. I say this as someone from the previous government that learned this the hard way. This point must be stressed by the donors and the international community as well. As a good starting point would be making strides on basic human rights for men and women, attract, regain, and retain Afghan capacity that has been painstakingly built over the past 20 years, and demonstrate that it's for the Taliban to demonstrate that they're allocating the domestic revenues that they've collected to pay some of the public finances, such as pay civil servants, but also other expenditures, and do it transparently. The international community, I think, should also seek guarantees that aid flow without hindrance by the Taliban. What does it mean? Specifically, no discrimination in access, no interference in recruitment process, access for monitoring and transparency and reporting are essential. Coming to the hot topic of the reserves release, I think it's very important for all of us to understand that the release of the reserves will not fix all of Afghanistan's economic woes. Too much stress on this raises unrealistic expectations and takes the focus and energy away from fundamental economic issues that need to be urgently addressed. I think it's important to state that the economy did not collapse primarily because of the inaccessibility to the reserves, but the abrupt stoppage in the aid that came to the country, which amounted to 40% of the GDP, or around $8 billion a year. There are three important questions in the monetary space. I know Governor Siddiq will talk about this himself as well, but how can the aid be brought to Afghanistan is an important one. Is the central bank adequately staffed and independent in its mandate to enable interbank, even only domestically, the transactions? And is there enough liquidity in the country to allow economic activities? Liquidity, in simple terms, are there enough Afghani banknotes in circulation? Do people have access to them? On ways to bring money and aid to Afghanistan, Julia might summarize their excellent work and the options that they have. On other two issues, ideally, central bank should be fully independent to carry out its functions. I say ideally because this would require an understanding by Taliban. I don't see any other alternatives that are ideal in the current situation. This would include, banking supervision, monetary policy, market operations, without any political influence, including printing of new Afghani notes, banknotes when they are needed. Having said all the above, it is important that the part of assets, starting with the portion that would enable private parties, both businesses and individuals, be released to enable them to withdraw funds for the banking sector to then operate. The national or net reserves that is the portion that belongs to the whole nation, I think can wait until a political settlement. It requires a legitimate, inclusive, and organized Afghan government in place. Additionally, the primary reason for the reserve is to keep the Afghani currency stable and cannot and should not be used to finance any expenditures in long-term discussions. And longer discussion includes intergenerational aspects, such as future generations of Afghans also should have a say on this. I will close with one point. I think Afghan institutions and Afghan capacity should not be forgotten in all this discussion. I think it's important to preserve systems and retain the good people. There are a lot of good people, with whom I'm in contact on daily basis, who would need support. They know how to run institutions. They will be the ones who would be implementing programs, be it through international agencies, be it the UN, or be it any government. At the end of the day, those are the Afghans who implement projects. I think some of the steps that the Taliban have taken with the private sector development, addressing some of the corruptions that I and my colleagues struggle so much with, are commendable. But more needs to be done. I think Taliban have to understand that an economy can work when people feel safe about their investments. They see a longer term sustainability, and they have a big role to play. I'll stop here and look forward to the rest of the discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Khalid. Let's now move on to our third speaker, Mr. Khalil Sadiq. Over to you. I think you're muted, sir. You'll have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for Wilson Center for arranging this important event. I believe the main subject for today's discussion is that how to channelize liquidity to the hand of the people in Afghanistan. The big problem is that now there is a lack of liquidity in the country. Central bank doesn't have anything, no dollar in their vault. Commercial banks, many of them, they don't have liquidity even with the central bank. So it's not from now, it was accumulated from years. So these banks, they have their problem and people are in need of money. Although they have started now, the United Nations and there are some organizations that they are moving some cash to Afghanistan through one of the commercial banks. But this commercial bank is only playing the role of custodian to this dollar, these dollars, which is 32 million per week. And although it's not sufficient, but it had its psychological effect in the market, which brought down the exchange rate of Afghani toward dollar. So from other side, there is a problem with the Afghani liquidity. I believe when I was in Afghanistan in 2015, the last, we had over 80 billion Afghani banknotes in our reserves. It was not part of the circulation, it was not in circulation, so just its reserves. Almost 90 billion Afghanis. And to that, up to this year, the net issue of banknote new issues, they were between 3 to 5 billion. Because the remaining was, we were collecting Afghani from the market by auctioning dollars each week. So we didn't need to inject more money to circulation and issue new money. And I believe that maybe the other 2 years also, the new issue of money in the market was not more than 5 billion per year, because I'm aware that in 2020 and 21, the amount of auctions in the market was doubled than 2019. So they were able to collect more Afghani. So maybe the Taliban regime, they are just trying, they are afraid of future. They do not want to put this money into the circulation. That's because there is a lot of complaints that the banknotes in the market, they are old enough, even the counting machines cannot take them. So that's one part. So I believe that how to enable the people to reach this or to take this money from the commercial banks, one is that let the commercial bank pay the salaries of the doctors, teachers, and maybe other social service employees. They can do it through their branches in dollar, or if there is not Afghani available with the central bank to convert. Although they say that we have it, but I doubt that they may not have it or they don't want to just circulate or to exchange it. That would be one part of that. The only, now because the central bank is not able, and I believe that now the international community or foreign countries that are not ready to work with Taliban directly to inject liquidity into the economy in Afghanistan. So the only way now would be just to shift a part of this job to the commercial bank or commercial banks. The second part, which I'm insisting on that as a central banker, that when international organizations or countries are dealing with the commercial banks, I will highly recommend it to only with the bank or banks which have the high level of corporate governance and due diligence system. Otherwise, these banks, some of them are maybe not trustable. I know them, they have a lot of problems. The NPL level which has now in these banks, they are because of this, the rule of the shareholders, which they took money and they have just created this problem. That's my recommendation. And so for Afghani, the other thing is that I believe that to allow the Central Bank of Afghanistan to be able to print, if they don't have Afghani, to print new Afghani through the company which they previously they were printing, which is a French one or someone. It can be the same banknotes, the same logo, everything the same. But otherwise, it would be a big problem if we just inject foreign currency. You know that Afghanistan economy is highly dollarized. If you are still injecting only foreign currency, paying salary in foreign currency, paying everything in foreign currency, so we are increasing the level of the dollarization, which will be a big problem in the future for the economy and for the country. So we have to find a way that how to establish like Afghani liquidity into the market, into the banking system. And one of them would be that one, to allow the Central Bank of Afghanistan, because it should be considered a non-political organization. So they have to print, it give them the right to print Afghani as they need it, but the same logo, the same thing which we have now in the circulation, to enable the people to benefit from that or solve the problem for the Afghani liquidity. Because dollar cannot reach all population in Afghanistan. There would be only teachers, doctors, and some. What about the ordinary people? How can they reach or have liquidity in their hand? How can they go to market and purchase something? From other humanitarian help, which is in kind, like medicine or food items, I heard that the distribution of that one, mainly these companies or the organizations, they're hiring foreign citizens like Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, or some Arab countries. I'm strongly against that one. They have to use Afghans, pay them, let them distribute that one. Don't allow foreign citizens to come here and benefit from the very bad economic position situation in Afghanistan. That's my recommendation. To be honest, considering the situation here in Kabul or in Afghanistan, unfortunately, 99% of the people has been taken hostage because of the ideological thing of this government, which is that's not fair for the country and for people. If they want, they should know, as Mr. Khalid mentioned, that releasing foreign reserves from Afghanistan will not solve the problem of Afghanistan. Only the problem will be solved if they can just go with international measures and have contact with the foreign countries, have trade, political relation. Then in this case, the economy will survive, the economy will just go ahead and increase all the production and everything. Otherwise, they cannot do that. From the news which I heard now that today from the New York Times, that 50% or 3.5% of this money they are suggesting will go for the victims of 9/11. I'm to be honest, I'm against that one. I'm not saying that the victims should not receive something, but who did 9/11 event? There were not one Afghan in there, even not one Afghan. There were Al Qaeda, which is based in Saudi Arabia. So they have to pay that one. They have to pay more than 3.5 billion, not from the poor people of Afghanistan. not from them. That would be not fair. That's my suggestion. But again, to summarize that one, we have to use now for the time being commercial bank or banks for distributing this liquidity, not just only a custodian. They have to, international organization, they have to talk with these banks. Do they have the possibility to distribute this money to the doctors or teachers? And then the government, the so-called government of Afghanistan, now they have to provide the list of doctors and other experts who are supposed to receive this salary from international organization or from the United Nations and give it to the banks. And based on a proper schedule, they will be coming to the bank branches and they will receive their salary. That's the only way we can do it. It's not this easy. It's a big problem in Afghanistan, unfortunately, but people deserve it and people need to receive this money. I do not have anything more than that, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you, Mr. Siddiqui. You made a number of important points, particularly the one about needing to find a way to establish liquidity with the Afghani, the Afghan currency, in a country that's been so heavily dependent on the dollar for such a long time. Let's now go to Julia Friedlander.
Thank you, Michael, and it's really a pleasure to speak with such an esteemed group of experts today. I would personally say that obviously I am not an Afghanistan expert on the ground, but what I can talk about is a little bit of the work that my team at the Atlantic Council has done to try to address some of these specific liquidity issues. We were approached in December by a group of humanitarian organizations and foreign governments saying we need to put our heads together and think about what are the alternative ways of delivering liquidity to the country, right? And there were two premises there. One is that, and one was sort of half solved by the administration's announcement today, that there will be ongoing litigation regarding central bank assets, and the second being that the State Department's designation of the Taliban as a terrorist organization is going nowhere. That, of course, leads to sort of stream effects within the commercial banking sector and a broad-scale de-risking that some of my colleagues here have discussed, drying up liquidity on the ground. So we thought of we assembled a group of regulatory experts, financial sector experts, people in new financial technologies to think, well, what are some alternative ways of handling this? The first was to establish a risk management framework regarding Afghanistan as a jurisdiction. Different NGOs, different banks, all seemingly having a different risk profile or risk tolerance with regards to Afghanistan. And there is precedent for this. There is specifically in Syria, which by some counts is the most sanctioned jurisdiction in the world. To provide an agreement of how are we jointly among NGOs, governments, financial institutions going to manage this to sort of offset the risk collectively. And so that's sort of more of an intellectual exercise that you would need to, maybe a government could host it or at least provide the framework for such a discussion. The second is to work with third-party jurisdictions. Again, there is precedent for this in other humanitarian crises, particularly regarding with Yemen, for example, where the United States has worked with a third-party jurisdiction to restore correspondent banking in a country that has broad-based liquidity, regional access, but also has enough dollars on the books. The third is a special purpose vehicle. And this is something that may be familiar to some in the Iran context, in the wake of the maximum pressure campaign under the Trump administration on Iran, that several organizations, and was together with the E3 governments, thought of a way to deliver and finance humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, to Iran outside of the reach of the U.S. dollar. This is a potential way to establish a commercial liquidity outside of a humanitarian aid framework, to offshore the risk from the commercial banks, to allow for a sort of closed loop with enhanced due diligence mechanisms built in that would ensure to the greatest extent possible that the funds and the recipients of funds would not be linked to the Taliban. Now, this could function within a commercial bank or separately, but would need an initial liquidity injection to sort of start the transaction. And again, that would be a potential method to allow for the beginning of commercial trade. Right. The fourth option is a little bit unorthodox, and that's actually digital currencies and blockchain technology. And again, there's a group of very serious people working on this at the moment. It does require that broad scale access to telecommunications, to have a smartphone, and have internet. But it does provide an avenue for donors, especially if you're thinking about individuals who want to pass small amounts of money between, to friends and family in the country that are getting gunked up within the commercial banking sector, or remittance organizations like MoneyGram, to place cash and fiat into a digital token, right, that is then transferred into Afghanistan and used on the ground, either as withdrawn as cash in local Afghanis, or if possible, actually used as a digital currency. Again, this is sort of, it's a bit of a greenfield idea, but as a group collectively, we thought it was worth consideration given the extreme shortage of cash for daily commercial activities on the ground. Again, that's just a short overview of what we thought of. I'm happy to go into those further, but defer again to the expertise of my colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Julia. I welcome the unorthodox, outside the box options, and also I think that your reference to other examples, some other country case studies was useful. I think one of the big challenges about this Afghanistan situation is that it's arguably unprecedented to have such a serious economic crisis, and to have a government there that's sanctioned and that is not recognized by any country. So it is useful to hear some of these references to other cases where this work has been done. So thank you. We're going to go to a discussion soon, but first, last but not least, wanted to allow Tony Wayne to offer some opening comments. So Ambassador Wayne, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the wonderful sharing of ideas and analysis from the others who are with us today. I think they've given a very good view of the challenges in the current situation and a number of the ideas going forward. I want to reiterate that we're not going to be, as those who care about Afghans staying alive this winter, we're not going to be effective if we don't get better ways for money to flow into the country. The UN is working on a cash swap, which is bringing some money in, but it is not sufficient to meet the humanitarian needs. The UN has said that they've asked for $8 billion worth of assistance to meet the needs for this year. And they've projected that you could end up at the end of this year of having 97% of Afghans in poverty. There need to be effective channels for getting cash in, for changing those dollars into Afghanis, as was mentioned. There also needs to be ways to get this economy going again, or you're just going to push more and more Afghans into poverty. We're already seeing regular reports of that now, of people who are well educated, who were in the Afghan middle class, who are running out of money. And as Julia mentioned, even the small amounts coming in, small amounts of money can't come in. So if you have family outside that want to send you money, you can't really do that right now. So we really need to work on all these systems urgently for the humanitarian reasons that so many people are donating individually in the United States and working on this in not only the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. So there's a tremendous immediate and short-term need to get these money flows working. And we have a number of good ideas. I think it is key that international donors, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN work together very hard on this. That includes the US, but the US isn't the be all and end all. It should be an international effort. And I think there are ways to reach consensus on that. The US is important because the bulk of the money that was in the Afghan central bank, what is in the United States. My understanding is that globally in all countries, there's an estimated $9 billion worth of these reserves. They're broken up, as Khalid mentioned, there are traditional government reserves that really probably will wait for a recognition, a negotiation, which is not anywhere near at this time because of a whole bunch of concerns that Michael mentioned at the beginning, including the representativeness, the inclusiveness of the government, human rights, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, a whole bunch of lists that donors are concerned about with the Taliban government. But there is other money, there is money, a lot of money in there, some of which, as we've read about in the New York Times today, may in fact be released as part of this court case in the United States, which could be good. And part of that would be for humanitarian needs. But it's important to recognize that an important chunk of that money actually belongs to individual Afghans and Afghan businesses and the commercial banks that were being held in the central bank. So this isn't former government money or Taliban government money. A lot of it belongs to Afghans not at all tied to either government or the Taliban. And so they have legitimate claims to this money. And that money, if some of that released over time, can really also help with this liquidity and getting the economy going again, keeping people employed, creating more employment. And so it's very important that we move in that direction also and think about that as we go forward. I want to reiterate the point that several of our speakers made about using Afghan capacity. There are a lot of well-trained and very capable Afghans that can contribute to this solution. And that includes people who used to work in the central bank, who have left the country, but I understand a number of whom have given the right signals of protection and independence, would be happy to go back and help the system function, help the system start functioning again within Afghanistan and between Afghanistan and other countries. So I think we need to look very carefully at how we do that and how we can, as some of us used to say in financial areas, build a ring fence around the central bank, i.e. Make the central bank independent and in a satisfactory way. So other countries and donors are sure that the central bank is going to be neutral. It's not going to have political interference but can help in that function of making this economy work again to meet the basic human needs of the Afghans. So that's I think a key area to work as we go forward. So I won't repeat the many excellent points my colleagues made, except to say that we have to keep focused on getting sufficient aid in and getting it distributed to meet basic humanitarian needs, to pay salaries, to keep health clinics open. We're going to have schools that can open again in March, and will teachers be paid? Will others be paid? And then just keep looking at how we can strengthen going forward the secure system. As Julia said, there are a number of good options, and I really think I know the governments are talking with the international institutions, but we need to see some progress on that, hope to see some progress on that soon going forward. So as in the case, and I do think it's really important to remember, there are other cases. There's Yemen, there's Syria, where money, and others where money has been able to get into very disastrous situations in relatively safe ways, and that ways that can convince even the skeptics in the United States or in other countries that yes, this money is going for its intended use. So let's open it up for discussion and turn it back to you, Michael. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. I think you did a great job of really highlighting some of the key points made by the panelists, and your own comments were also much appreciated. So we already have a large number of questions in the audience, so I'm not going to ask too many questions. I'll just ask a few, which I hope will spark some more discussion. The first question I'll pose to the panel is, I hear very frequently from many observers and many individuals, including some senior U.S. officials, that there is such a great challenge of working with risk-averse banks in the West, and specifically this idea of there being such a big struggle to convince these banks that they can indeed send money to Afghanistan without running afoul of the sanctions regime. So the question is how to make that case to banks that it's safe to do this on a very basic level. The conventional wisdom is that you need to get these documents, these comfort letters put out there, which essentially offer assurances to banks that it's okay for them to send money in. But this is a challenge. So I'd be curious if anyone wanted to address this issue of banks that are so conservative and so risk averse in the West, for fear of the concern of running afoul of sanctions. So would anyone like to comment on that issue?
Yeah.
Please.
I believe that the correspondent banking relation or banking relation, it's a bilateral issue between an Afghan bank and the foreign banks. So the foreign banks, mainly they are looking at how is the level of the corporate governance in this bank? How is their other you see DD? How are they managing? How is the influence of shareholders in the bank, in these banks? This issue is not a recent one. It's from years. When I was in the central bank, I was talking with the commercial banks. The Central Bank of Afghanistan cannot do anything to encourage foreign banks to give it corresponding banking. It's up to you, because it's a bilateral issue. When the foreign bank is not convinced that this bank is really based on accepted rules and regulations of the commercial banks, they will never open a corresponding banking system, banking account, or will deal with you. That was the result. The banks who were able to reach to this level, they had banking relation with big banks like Citibank or say some other banks. But I believe it relates to the banks in Afghanistan. It's not an issue that the government of the United States or governments of foreign countries, they can force their banks to have relation with Afghan banks. In Afghanistan, there's a lot of problem now and before also. Drug money, terrorism, and the relation with this money dealers in Afghanistan. Money dealers, many of them, if not many, some of them really, they were involved in drug money, they were involved in all other dirty monies. So I believe that's not an issue that the governments here can encourage, because the foreign banks will ask their government, okay, if anything happens, then I would not be responsible. Can you give me this assurance? And no government can give this assurance that if there is any dirty money goes through this transaction, then there would not be any penalty for them. So I don't see a very short or soon solution for this issue. That's not an easy thing. But the only thing I believe that the Central Bank of Afghanistan, the Taliban should accept that rule, that it should be a non-political and independent organization. If international community reach to this level that really this bank is an independent and not a political instrument in the hand of Taliban, they may deal with it. That would be our first step, that they should appoint an independent governor, and they have to guarantee their independence, their security, which I doubt the Taliban will do that or not. That would be the only way. No, I don't see any other way for that. Thank you.
I mean, I can jump in here a little bit too. I mean, I think that the licenses that were provided by the U.S. Treasury actually are unprecedented, right? I can't recall reading something that actually was, what was the equivalent of we will not prosecute, right? Or not prosecute or fine. And so then it is a question of commercial gain from large Western banks, which we'll see, which had a profit to gain while there was a large Western presence in the country, and they were a part of essentially an economy that was supporting a Western presence there. So again, I also do not see I share the assessment that large commercial banks will not re-enter the country. I think that's why we try to think about ways to intermediate between Western financial institutions and Afghanistan, and other ways of building in other ways of delivering liquidity. I don't see that moving in the near future.
Yeah, so I would just add that this is going to be it's a confidence building measure, because Julia's right. There's space in the Treasury licenses, but banks have to assess their risk, reputational risk, and versus the benefit. As there's agreement on institutions that, in a sense, are working and are felt to be secure with money flow and others among the international donors, if it's seen that the central bank is made independent and has international oversight on it too, there may be some banks that will be more willing to come back in, but this will be a gradual process, and they will have to see that there's reason to be confident operating, and it's not a lot of money, as Julia said. They're not going to make a lot of money, so this will be gradual, not too soon, I don't think.
Okay, so also I would like to highlight one point. There are two parts of issue of correspondent bank relationship. One is the making of new correspondent bank account with one of the foreign bank. But after the collapse of the previous government, the issue raised with the intermediary banks. So, like example, the commercial private banks, they have correspondent banks in US dollar denominated currency, either with Turkish bank, Central Asian countries, or European banks. They don't have any problem for the settlement of US dollar transactions, but their concern is their intermediary bank, their correspondent banks, because any US dollar transaction has to clear, and also after the due diligence of the US banks has to process. So what they say as per our US correspondent bank's advice, we are not permitted to do any settlements either inward and outward related to Afghanistan transactions. They didn't specify a single bank in Afghanistan. And we experienced this before when Western Union was licensed by the US Treasury Department. We started operation of Western Union, but we faced a huge challenge. Our fund was stuck with Western Union for a long time. And the concern of Western Union was that they tried a lot to send our fund through the number of US banks, but the US banks denied to process the Western Union transactions. And finally, we advise our correspondent banks to direct open their accounts with Western Union Bank, which is based in Europe. So now they are doing all the settlements with the Western Union Bank itself. So this is basically the matter of concern. But about the opening of new correspondent bank account, yes, this is true. It's not the issue of just last 6 months. These challenges remain from last 2 decades with Afghanistan banks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very useful answers to it. What's to me is a very tough and complex question. So thank you for that. Wanted to pose another question, and I'll put out a what I would describe as another unorthodox recommendation that's been put out there by a number of observers. And it relates to the Afghan central bank, which I think we all agree is such a critical issue given the centrality of that institution in any recovery plan. We've already heard some really interesting thoughts on that. So specifically, there has been this idea put forward about the possibility of privatizing the central bank in Afghanistan, which would entail identifying a separate bank, a separate private bank with no known ties to the Taliban, taking on the responsibilities of the state bank. And of course, one of the major incentives for doing this would be to avoid the risk of sending money into an institution where the Taliban could get access to it. If it's a private bank, then it wouldn't be an issue. So I guess if anyone wants to respond, does this sound like something worth pursuing, or does it seem that there's so many other more, I guess, less unorthodox means to work with the existing central bank without having to take it apart and come up with something new? So if anyone would like to address this question of whether it makes sense to think about a privatization plan with the Afghan central bank.
Yeah.
Yes, you're the logical person to respond. Yeah, thanks.
I believe, yeah, that's a way, but say any bank, a private bank, what they will need. First, a guarantee from the current government in Afghanistan. A guarantee that they will accept this one and they will never interfere in their activities. And number two, that international banks or governments, they have to recognize them and also to be in contact with them and also in transactions. If they have these two issues, which I doubt that the Taliban will accept that one, but because it's challenging their authority, they may not accept that one. If they are not accepting that one, then why should not go for alternative of that? To make this current central bank of Afghanistan, as per the current bank, the Afghanistan bank law, a real independent a non-political organization and install a non-political person over there. And the government gave the assurances that they will never interfere in the bank's issues because they will run the bank, the central bank's activity as per the law of the Afghanistan bank. But that is a possibility if they cannot accept that one to go for a private bank and just shift all the banks, central banks activity except one, that let the issue of banknote, Afghani banknote, be held with the current Afghanistan bank. All other controlling other commercial banks, so transactions with foreign countries, all other functions of the central bank can be transferred to the private bank. Only if they want, they can have the authority to issue and print the Afghani banknotes. That would be a solution, but I doubt that the Taliban government, they are willing to accept this one because it will challenge their authority. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond, or should I go on to the next question? Okay. So wanted to pose a question about a decision that the Taliban made, I believe back in November, to ban all foreign currency in Afghanistan. I believe this was back in November, it was quite some time ago. Now, several of you have noted the importance of ensuring that you have any liquidity crisis addressed by emphasizing the Afghani currency, getting more local currency into the system, into the economy. But still, this is a country that's been so heavily dependent on dollars for so long, and it would be pretty drastic, I would think, to just come out with an economy where there's no foreign currency at all. Do you think that this decision by the Taliban, and I'm not sure to the extent that it's been enforced, but is this something that could impact the type of interventions and ideas that you've all laid out? Again, emphasizing just how dependent the Afghan economy has been on US dollars for such a long time. Is this an important decision? Is it a significant decision? Does it have an impact on the issues that we discussed? Again, the Taliban decision to ban all foreign currency. Anyone want to address that?
Yeah, if I may, Michael.
Please.
I think that from what my understanding is, talking to people on the ground, it's banning transactions in other currencies. So meaning that Afghani should be used as a primary vehicle for all transactions. I think it was a timely and good decision. And with the way it was enforced, there was also another aspect of it. You know, a lot of foreign currencies, mainly US dollar, was smuggled out of Afghanistan, you know, for all these years, but it accelerated over the last 4 or 5 years to Iran, that needs it, to Central Asia, and through Central Asia to Iran. That has actually helped stabilize the Afghani versus US dollar exchange rate. Otherwise, you know, when we went into this enormity of the economic challenge, Afghani would have been worthless by now. I think it really helped that. It hasn't impacted any of the small amounts of money that have come in US dollars. You know, the central bank so far has done the right thing of, you know, making sure that it moves and it goes to the intended purposes that the UN and other agencies have wanted. So I commend them for this. I think it was a timely decision and helped with price stability.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Siddiq.
I believe, as I mentioned before, that Afghanistan economy has been dollarized since 20 or 24, 25 years. It's not only dollar. When we are talking about dollarization, it doesn't mean only dollar. It's any foreign currency. All east and south provinces, they were dealing mainly with Pak rupees. West part of Afghanistan, Herat, Nimroz, Farah, they were dealing with Iranian Tuman. And then in Kabul, they were also these currency plus dollar. Even when you were going to buy a used car, they were giving you the price first in dollar, then in rupee, and the third in Afghani. Dollarization is not a process that you can solve it in a decree. So it needs all these things. First, stability, political stability. Number two, economic development. And then trust of the people. So when you do not bring all these things, you cannot solve the problem of dollarization. My information shows still when you go to the eastern part of Afghanistan, people there are using Pak rupee. Even you may remember Pakistan 2 months ago or a month ago, they announced that they are giving commodities to Afghanistan using Pak rupee. So who is paying this Pak rupee? An Afghan merchant. From where is he obtaining this rupee? From the market. So I don't think that it's a good decision if a country can bring into power its own currency, but it's not in the process to do it by decree. It needs economic and political and then security issues. Then it's a gradual issue. It cannot be in 1 or 2 years. It needs only economic development and stability in the country. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate those interventions. I want to start getting to the audience questions now in the time we have left. I'll try to get to as many as I can. The first one, which is posed to anyone that would like to respond, do the Taliban have a development model? How do governance patterns seen in the last few months, especially since August and September when the Taliban took over, relate to Afghanistan's history, particularly outside Kabul and in rural areas? So I don't know if anyone would like to address this question of whether the Taliban have any type of development model. I know that many of you are economists, so, oh, Tony, please.
I'll start off and then Khalid can clean up after me. I don't think they do have a development model. And I don't think they have a uniform policy. And I think they're still figuring out how to govern the country. They're trying to figure out how to deliver services. They're not used to delivering services on a wide scale. And so there's a great deal of learning going on. And as Khalid was saying earlier, I think it was Khalid, that they're going to learn how you gain legitimacy as a governing force. And you do that by being able to deliver basic services to people and keep the economy going. And I don't think they've all learned this. And my suspicion is they have a number of different approaches to how this should be done. I do think on the humanitarian front, I hear from NGOs and from UN representatives and others, they are giving wide access for humanitarian delivery. And that's positive that they're doing that. And they are learning the importance of international NGOs. And I understand they're gradually learning the importance of the expertise among Afghans who have been in NGOs and the importance of those organizations. But I think it's still going to be a very long learning experience. Maybe I understand they've come up with a short-term budget. Maybe Khalid has something he could say about that. But anyway, so I think they have a lot of learning that they can still do, period.
I completely agree. There is no development model. But the more frustrating issue is that they don't listen to people who know and understand this. They have the experience within the government has been indifferent. They have, to their credit, kept a few good people in the Ministry of Finance, but parts of it, and the budget and treasury management, which thankfully were not easily replaceable given their expertise. But in other areas, they've gone with removing quite a few of good people. Afghan institutions always struggled with capacity, and the ones that were relatively better were functioning because of a thin veneer of capacity at the top. The best functioning ministry, the more sophisticated Ministry of Finance, you had a handful of 100 good people, and they're gone. Taliban's focus, if there is a development model, is mostly on private sector development, but that's mostly has been only focused on how to reduce hindrances for importers. You cannot run an economy only on imports, but also you cannot grind down taxes to zero. You need to collect taxes and show and demonstrate with your budget. The budget, I know of people who've worked with them. There was a lot of suspicion. They did not want a budget. They said, we have a economic committee. We'll gather the way we've been gathering taxes for the last 20 years, and we'll spend the way we want. Why would we need a budget? I know it took a lot of convincing to have a 3-month budget. For them to move back the budget by 3 months, was disappointing, because the whole reason of having a budget started in the winter was that you get all the logistics and procurement and everything settled in the 3 months before the spring, so operations could start without delay. They have showed that they've done a decent job in collecting revenues from customs, but where do those revenues go? What do they show in terms of expenditure? Nothing has been seen so far. So unfortunately, there isn't any model, development model. There are opportunities, but hopefully the stability that right now is there. I think I hope they realize that they have to work on fundamentals, on agriculture, on mining, and other areas. But as an overall, it has been disappointing. They've removed quite a few of good people, even in humanitarian aspects of it. Some people that they've brought back in key positions challenge the basics of humanitarian assistance. They create hindrances, takes a lot of time and headache to to convince them, why NGOs should be able to operate, why should you not meddle in their activities, but overall, I don't see any development model.
Well, thank you very much. And I think there's a broader question to be asked as well as to whether the Taliban has a governance model. And we know that traditionally, historically, its governance model has revolved around repression and force and swift justice and all of that. The Taliban, of course, did operate shadow governments during the years of insurgency. And yet we heard soon after the takeover in August that it was struggling to carry out even very basic tasks of governance, such as collecting tariffs at the border. I mean, as Khalid mentioned, I guess they've learned some things because they have been collecting revenue successfully, but what's become of that is unclear. Question now getting to the international relations aspect of all this. And this sort of picks up on something, some points that Tony made. The question is, actually it's a two-part question. Is there one particular actor, one country, one institution that really needs to step up and lead a global effort to initiate an economic recovery? I think it's true what Tony said, that we can't necessarily expect the US government to play that role. But that raises the question, when you have for instance, to use an imperfect analogy, when you have a group of college students working on a group project, everyone wants to get involved, but oftentimes you don't have one person that steps up and takes charge. And if that doesn't happen, there's procrastination, and then people expect a free ride. So that said, isn't it then important for the US to play a lead role? And the second part of the question is, should there be a primary negotiator within the international community to engage with the Taliban? And if so, who should that negotiator be? So it's a tough two-part question, rather complex, but if anyone would like to address this issue of specifically, should the US be playing more of a role than it's playing now? And separate from that, should there be a single entity that should be leading this effort? Yes, go ahead, Khalid.
Yeah. It might sound like a cruel joke, but what we've read on the New York Times this morning, I think that if the US does less, may be better. Is how I did not want to put this in my opening remarks, not to overshadow this the discussion, but it's outrageous. What the decision on the reserves is, and unfortunately, if it comes true, this is the single most biggest blow that you can deliver to the Afghan economy. Afghani would be a worthless, dirty, old piece of paper, when you don't have the assets that back it up. Even if it's locked for years, for decades, it would still be better, because that's what the main purpose of it is, the currencies backing up. I think such blunders for US to show global leadership, these are examples, but unfortunately we see blunder after blunder. How would the Ukrainian feel about US's support right now when they see the plight of Afghans? But on the actors on the ground, I think UN is doing a commendable job. They need support. They need support from other institutions as well. UN is good at political messaging. They're seen as neutral, but they need expertise. That's why I mentioned, you need the IMF and the World Bank on development, on monetary and fiscal and macro issues to engage, and some others who bring expertise to different areas. How would you go about using, for example, the National Solidarity Program that is local governance, where you enable people, 2 decades of investment when, these are expert questions that those institutions that have led them can answer. So the UN is rightly placed. They need more support and help. And I hope that the IMF and the World Bank boards enable them, because the management and the people who are working are desperate. They understand the gravity, but they need a really enforcing go signal from their boards to be able to re-engage.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. No, I think you made a very important point there. And indeed, I don't think there's been a formal announcement.
Ambassador Tony has wanted to.
Julia wants to say something, and then I'd like.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you pop up. Please go ahead.
No worries. I mean, I think I agree. I actually agree, Michael, with what you said about sort of the high school project. And I mean, I think it's no one has blinked first. And everybody is in essence waiting for the U.S. to show leadership. I agree with Tony that the U.S. cannot do it alone, and I agree with my colleagues on the panel that there are problems with the decision that was essentially reached today. Understanding the bind that the U.S. government does find itself in. That's why this sort of consortium collective assessment idea, I think, has legs, because it can be convened by the U.S. government in conjunction with other partner governments who also, hold reserves, albeit less, with international organizations together and come up with selective solutions. Otherwise, no one sees first mover advantage here. So,
and just to add on that, one, I do think the UN needs to be in the lead right now, and there's a decision coming up on a renewal of the mandate of the UN Special Representative. And I think I hope there will be consensus to strengthen that mandate going forward, even if it's only for a year more, because they are clearly the main actors on the ground, and they're doing a lot of good work. And it's a really hard situation. They don't have all the answers. They don't have all the support. But they can do that and talk to both sides. I think the U.S. has a very important role to play in the convening of other donors and international institutions, but it needs to be in a way that it's not the U.S., sort of a U.S. campaign going forward. It needs to be an international campaign with the U.S. as a big, important player in that, because it brings a lot of potential resources, but so do the Europeans and so do others. And I think doing it together and doing it with the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN helps add a legitimacy and a solidity to the recommendations that you can get going forward. But that effort needs energy and drive that is sustained going forward if it's going to make positive differences in the lives of these millions and millions of Afghans who are in danger.
Well, thank you very much to you, Tony, and Julia. And actually, Julia, there's a question specifically for you. Why don't we pose that to you before we move on? It's really more of a clarification question. The question is, what group are you working with, and where can we read on these channels to get money into Afghanistan that you discussed? I assume this is based on your Atlantic Council work, but if you just want to provide a clarification on that.
Sure, thank you. No, so we will be putting it out shortly, the document. Each of those recommendations reflect conversations with specific actors. We've sort of anonymized them for reasonable purposes. But if whoever is asking the question, would like to get in touch with us, we're happy to help.
Thank you. Another question, which I think is a very important one, a very simple one, but a very important one, because I'm not sure if we got into the specifics. How do we find out which banks in Afghanistan have strong capacity and governance? Is there a good resource to consult? Obviously, that's a subjective question, but I don't know if anyone would like to address that. Are there some existing resources that can be consulted to get more information on capacity of banks in Afghanistan?
Yes. Well, the banks are rated by the central bank. And then we have Camel rating 1, the best one, and 5 is the poorest. So we have banks with best Camel rating. There are 2 banks with Camel rating 2. And I believe there are 2-3 banks with Camel rating 3. So yes, we have I should not take the names, but as a commercial private bank, but yes, there are good banks with best corporate governance and also best Camel rating.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left. I do want to pose one or two more questions to the extent that we can. I have a it's sort of perhaps tough to ask a question bearing on the medium to long term, given that there's so many incredibly complex immediate term needs, but I think this is an interesting question to pose, so I'll pose it from our audience. Is it a feasible possibility to consider creating an ROZ-like arrangement straddling the Pakistan-Afghanistan border with preferential access to US markets? ROZ, of course, is reconstruction opportunity zones, which are meant to be these areas where you can produce goods that come into the US with tariff-free access or preferential access. Maybe a case of putting the cart before the horse, but would anyone like to discuss this idea of border ROZs, and if that is something that could conceivably make sense to contemplate down the road? If not, that's okay. I understand that the focus is very much on the immediate term right now.
I can quickly
yes.
comment on this if didn't.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, the whole idea of ROZs is to bypass local laws and regulations that do not favor private sector development. But you have to ask, responding directly to the question, what are we exporting to the US? Probably not much. I think it's not the bilateral trade that has been impacted. With Pakistan, trade would still go. I know with Iran and other countries, the traders would take money in briefcases. They've done it in the 1990s, but that's the greater question is, how would you make the whole economy work? You can have good examples of ROZs working in a really terrible situation for all people. Should be further pursued. I don't have a lot of expertise in this, but I don't believe that would address most of the Afghan issues, and particularly, if you don't have a lot of exports that ROZs would support, I don't think that they will have a significant impact on the overall economy.
Thanks. Tony, were you going to say something?
No,
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
they were going to be comments very consistent with what Khalid said. There are a lot of, you got to get the whole economy running first and seeing what this trade framework comes up with this Taliban government. And I think, just to reiterate a lot, we're talking about trying to meet the short and medium term needs and get the economy, get liquidity flowing into the economy to help with the humanitarian problems and keep people from falling into poverty, keep the economy alive. So there's a whole lot to do, and there's this whole agenda that international wider donors, world donors, and even the regional countries have with the Taliban before you get to other discussion of deeper relationships with that government, let alone recognition. As I mentioned earlier, as we all know, there's the human rights issues and the women who've been disappearing. There's the issue that this government is still not inclusive. It's not ethnically inclusive, and it doesn't include elements other than the Taliban. There's still big questions that people reasonably have about counterterrorism capacity and about all the drugs that are being produced. So there's a whole lot that's going to have to be worked through gradually between regional countries who want to support Afghanistan going forward. But there's a real short-term need to help Afghans survive this horribly difficult period and to not have repeated humanitarian crises, not have next winter be as bad as this winter. And so I think that's what we're looking at right now. And there will be a record of cooperation that will emerge from this dialogue and this work in these months ahead.
Thanks, Tony. And to those issues about rights and inclusivity issues, today there have been reports that several foreigners were kidnapped by the Taliban in Kabul. This is unacceptable, clearly, and these are things that can't be ignored. We're just about done. There's one more question that's such a broad question that could be its own separate session, but I think it could allow and one or two of you, if you'd like, to offer a 30-second elevator speech as to what the final word on this is. The question is, what would be the message to the US Congress on how to address this issue? So I would invite, if a few of you would like to offer a 30-second elevator speech that you would give to a key member of Congress or a senior staff, I would certainly invite you to do that right now, if anyone would like to. Anyone want to do so?
Well,
No?
I guess I would say as in many situations, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The priority at this time is to find ways to help keep Afghans alive, help keep babies from dying, help keep mothers from selling their kidneys, help keep parents from selling their children. That's what we need to focus on in the near future, and focus on when people are arrested or disappear or do things like that. We've got to be tough on that also. And so I think we have to be bold in that humanitarian concern about Afghans that we've worked with for 20 years and shown great care and investment in Afghans, not in any particular country. And so we need to move to do that while we address our long-term, medium and long-term concerns about the people that are currently in power.
Yeah, if I may as well, I think the US's responsibility with the Burj evacuation does not end. While the administration may want to see Afghanistan in rear view mirror, I think ignoring Afghanistan will have bad consequences, not just for the US, but the whole world as well. We've seen this time and again. I hope that the US Congress and the administration understand they still have a big moral obligation. And it's not just for saving Afghans, what Tony put so well, but also for the US's credibility. What sort of an ally is US perceived in the future? If this is how people are treated, I think it's time for US to look to show leadership. Everyone, including big Western countries, look up to US. What is the US going to do? And they will follow. I think they have to take that leadership role and help. It's important. It's not just morally and ethically the right thing to do, but it's also for the long-term US interest, and not in the region, but globally as well.
Well, thank you very much. And I think just, looking at that question from a really immediate term lens, I know that many on the ground, many delivering assistance on the ground are very concerned that once the winter in Afghanistan ends, that the global attention, even on relief efforts, even on humanitarian assistance efforts will wind down and reduce. And clearly that's not acceptable. So I think it's important to keep having discussions like this. And for this terrific group of experts to keep doing what they're doing, to keep the attention on this issue. We're going to do that at the Wilson Center. Unfortunately, we need to wrap up, but I wanted to thank all 5 of our panelists for joining us, and particularly Khisro Fasli, who joined us from Kabul, where it's in the evening. And thank you to the informal group led by Tony Wayne and Rahula Osmani for co-hosting this. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Thank you for the great questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions, but really appreciate everyone for taking part. And with that, we will conclude. We are adjourned. Everyone stay well and stay healthy.
Thank you.